All right, good Saturday, everybody. Hope you're enjoying your Saturday. A lot of college football games going on. But of course, I know that all eyes are on Hurricane Dorian as it continues its trek off towards the southeast United States and the northwest Bahama Islands. It's a very well organized system today. Since we're doing the update in the daytime, we're looking at the visible satellite imagery, and we can see that very clear eye of a very strong hurricane moving off towards the west, if not slightly, just a little bit north of due west. So very powerful system. Hasn't changed overall too much in size. It's still relatively small compared to other storms we might remember, but still packing quite a punch. Still a very dangerous hurricane. It's overall moving at a pretty good clip. A little bit of shear coming in on the north side of, or especially the northwest side of Dorian, helping to keep the western side of the storm a little bit weaker, and most of the action going on the eastern side of the system. So most of the strong winds have been able to expand a little bit more on the eastern side and the northern side of the storm. On the western side, not so much. Again, you have the forward motion moving against the winds on the west side and also a little bit of shear. So the western side still overall pretty weak, but that doesn't really diminish the overall concern with this storm. Still very powerful, and these systems reach a point in which they kind of reach their first phase of kind of maximum intensity, and then they start to go through these eye wall replacement cycles. All hurricanes do it, and they collapse the old eye wall, build a new one, and it becomes a little bit larger, a little bit stronger, and the overall wind field of the storm becomes larger as well. Dorian has yet to undergo this phase, but it seems likely that Dorian will undergo one or maybe even two of these over the next 2 to 3 days. It's critical when these happen, especially when it comes close to the northwest Bahamas and eventually the southeast United States coast, because usually as they're ongoing, the storm begins to weaken a little bit. The wind field might expand, but the storm will be weakening when it goes through these cycles. So when these cycles occur are pretty critical when it comes to landfall intensity. Looking at the upper level parts of the atmosphere, that trough we were mentioning is now well towards the northeast. We have this overall flow beginning to push Dorian off mainly towards the west. And we're also looking at the upper level system coming out of the Rockies as we speak. And we also have that upper level low that's moving off towards the west and southwest for today. So a lot of key moving parts. This upper level system will be the first moving part that will be key to the steering pattern starting to collapse on top of Dorian going into tomorrow. This upper level system will track somewhat like this. And once it gets over the eastern United States tomorrow, that's when this ridge of high pressure, this nose, begins to weaken a little bit. Most of your high pressure is going to be over here, and you're going to have an upper level high pressure over here, and very light steering flow just to the north of Dorian. So it will likely begin to slow down considerably over the next few days. Looking at the official forecast track for the National Hurricane Center, see hurricane warnings in effect for most of the northwest Bahamas. Hurricane watch is also in effect for down towards the southwest. And we're looking at a nice slowdown in the forward motion as we go, like we've been talking about, tomorrow night and going into Labor Day. This would be very, very bad news for these northwest Bahamas, with a potential strong Category 4 hurricane nearly stalling out. That would put hours upon hours of major hurricane force winds and a lot of rainfall as well. So that would put just a tremendous amount of flooding and devastating winds on top of that for an extended period of time. So that would be just a horrific situation for the northwest Bahamas. Unfortunately, most models are trending towards a very, very slow motion near these islands. So if you know anyone there, definitely heed the evacuation warnings along those islands. Could be very devastating over the next 48 to 72 hours along some of those islands. So very concerning situation there across part of the Bahamas. Looking at the rainfall potential, you'll notice that the track did shift a little bit to the east compared to yesterday. Most of the heavy rainfall potential focused on the northern Bahama Islands and very near where the center of the storm will track in this general motion over the next 4 to 5 days. So once we get up into here, again, if we go back to the track, notice how large the cone still is, as expected. We're getting to the point now with these very slow-moving storms as they get into near the Bahamas, as we go into tomorrow. These slow-moving storms, every little wobble counts, especially when it's this close to the east coast of Florida, the Bahamas, and eventually the Carolinas. Every wobble counts, especially if Dorian were to grow in size even more so as we go into the end of the holiday weekend. Any little bit closer to the east coast of Florida puts a little bit more impacts to the east coast of Florida. Given this current track, I'm just going to go ahead and go through the potential scenarios here. If we look at the current track, looking at this would manage to keep the strongest impact, the strongest winds just off the coast of Florida and into Georgia if this track were to pan out. Again, even if the storm were to grow in size, the western side is still pretty weak compared to the eastern side. So the storm will grow in size, but the eastern side is going to be a little bit worse than the west. So if this track were to pan out, this would put the worst of it off the coast of eastern Florida. There will still be some impacts. I mean, there'll still be some tropical storm force winds over the eastern part of Florida, felt along all on the coast from about West Palm northward if this track were to pan out, and up into the Carolinas eventually. If this were to nudge just a little bit further towards the west, we're talking about a Hurricane Matthew type of situation from 2016, and that puts the hurricane force winds right along the coastline on the western side of this storm. And then, of course, even further east than that would mean almost no impacts along the east coast. So every little wobble counts at this particular juncture in terms of impacts on Florida, the timing of impacts on the Bahamas, and eventual impacts into the Carolinas. So still a lot to watch. Definitely don't let your guard down anywhere along the East Coast at this particular point. Still a lot to watch. If you're watching along the west coast of Florida, though, I know there was a lot of panic over there, a lot of potential cancellations, a lot of supplies going out. Overall, the impacts look fairly minimal to none along the west coast at this particular point. If this were to come further inland, if this were to take a major jog to the west and go inland, that would definitely ramp up the potential impacts on the west coast. But even then, we're still talking about from no impacts to maybe tropical storm force. Again, remember, the western side a little bit weaker. So overall, the west coast looking a lot better at this juncture on parts of Florida. The east coast still has a lot of time to watch this system. A lot of things can change, and especially up in the Carolinas, the concern is starting to grow as you get into South Carolina and North Carolina. So still a lot of scenarios that's still to talk about. Looking at the European model, looking at the initialization, we have this ridge of high pressure to the north, helping to steer Dorian off towards the west. The latest run this afternoon showing off that upper level disturbance I was pointing out at the beginning of the video, still located over the eastern U.S. sometime early Monday morning on Labor Day, and the storm basically stationary over the northwest Bahama Islands. Very powerful storm, stationary, just going to cause a ridiculous amount of problems across those islands. In fact, I think some of the model data I was looking at earlier on today, if it were to stall this much, I mean, almost for a 2-day time frame over these northwest Bahama Islands, we're talking about rainfall totals well over 2 feet. So just a lot of rain on that eastern side of the storm. So again, if this were to just be a little bit closer towards the east coast of Florida, even if it doesn't make landfall, yes, I guess the heaviest rain would still stay east of Florida, but that would put a prolonged period of coastal flooding into parts of the east coast of Florida, some gusty winds going into the coast of Florida, if it's just a tad bit closer. So even if it stalls over the Bahamas, they may be getting the worst of the storm compared to the east coast of Florida, but still impacts. A lot of rip currents, a lot of swells, high waves, coastal flooding, gusty winds right along the coast. So again, there's still going to be impacts along the east coast. It's just the severity. We're still waiting to monitor that. But right now, it looks like there's a very good consensus between the European and even the GFS model, the American model, that this storm will be pretty much centered right over these islands and causing devastating impacts, and for quite an extended period of time. So unfortunately, for the Bahamas, the consensus is that there will be a major hurricane, potentially Category 4 in nature, stalling over these islands, causing just major problems. So unfortunately for the Bahamas, nothing has gotten any better for them. A little bit of better news for Florida, and a little bit more concern for the Carolinas. That overall has been the trend over the last 24 hours. But I will stress once again that as that system comes and into the eastern U.S. and starts to pick up Dorian off towards the north, Every little wobble counts. When it starts to slow down its forward motion also matters. So if it's going to slow down later, that would end up over here before it starts to pull towards the north, again, a little bit closer to Florida. Or if it slows down even quicker, it would be on the northeastern side of these Bahama Islands, and then really lessen the impacts along the east coast of Florida. So still a few wobbles here and there to get out of our system before we really know exactly the potential impacts. What we do know, hurricane warnings for the Bahamas, major impacts here. That's pretty much a given at this particular juncture. The Bahamas are going to get a pretty big storm, pretty big problem on their hands. Now the question is, how much impacts are we going to see along the east coast from the Carolinas down towards South Florida? So still some questions to be answered, but overall the trends have been much better when we're talking about Florida impacts in parts of the southeast United States. So plenty of time to watch for the Carolinas. Again, don't want to forget anybody up there. Obviously, the trends have shifted towards the Carolinas, increasing the impacts there. But again, any little bit wobble then could still bring the storm just a little bit further offshore. So there's still a chance that this storm could stay just offshore and not impact anybody, at least the worst of it. I won't take that away, that there still will be some coastal erosion all along this coast from Florida all the way up to the Outer Banks. There will be coastal erosion, there will be coastal flooding, there will be high waves, and there will be gusty winds, rip currents, all that sort of nature. There will be coastal impacts from this storm, regardless of where this goes. So I definitely don't want to underestimate that. There's going to be coastal impacts. It's just a matter of, will we see those hurricane force winds, those severe winds start to touch these coastlines? That's what we're kind of waiting to see. And really, overall, the flooding potential impact, again, on the western side, is a little bit less. If we look at the overall rainfall forecast, much of the heavy rain is along that eastern side of the storm. So again, it would take a major jog towards the west and a landfall into Florida to really ramp up these rainfall totals along the east coast in this case. That's what it looks like right now. So still plenty to monitor. Don't want to forget that there's you still want to remain vigilant along the east coast, but it's certainly not, still is not a panic time along the east coast of Florida at this particular juncture, and especially not along the west coast. So still plenty of time to watch it. We'll have to closely monitor this over the coming days. It's going to be slowing down. It's going to be growing in size. The impacts are going to start to move into the Bahamas and eventually the east coast of the United States. So I'll continue to monitor it and update it as I can. Again, these are my thoughts and my thoughts alone for the official forecast. Stick to the National Hurricane Center and their track. Monitor it very closely. Any trends over the coming days, your National Weather Service office, your local weather service office, pay attention to them as well. And stay safe, stay informed. Don't panic, but stay informed and stay prepared, stay vigilant. That is it for now. I'll update as I can.